Dr. Dana Tassone here with participants in HFT 6228, a graduate course in hospitality and tourism management. And today we're discussing chapter 8 in the book. And at this point in the chapter, we become very practical. We actually see how to do the HR function. Prior to that, we saw what needs to be done and why, the what's and the whats. And you know from your management practices, you always tell people what and why, and then you tell them how. Well, the rest of the chapters are how to do. And each chapter identifies a functional strategy. Now, some people may say, well, you know, recruitment, which is the title of this chapter, recruitment and selection, that's not a function of management. The functions of management are planning, organizing, influence, and control, which is true from a generic standpoint. But when you look within a functional area, which the Human Resource Office is, you then have functions within the area. And one of the functions within that area, as you've already noticed, is recruitment and selection. And the reason it's strategic is because it follows a systemic process. It's not ad hoc. And in strategic organizations, everything is related to everything else. It should be evident by now that nothing that we've discussed here is mutually exclusive. Everything relates to everything else. And so the HR officer is required to participate in the strategic planning process for the organization. And what is that process? That process begins with scanning the external environment. What's the external environment? It's all of those factors that exist outside of the organization that will have an impact on that organization, and they're factors that are beyond the control of the organization itself. And thus, the organization must be cognizant of these factors for the purpose of identifying proactive strategies in order to prevail within that external environment. So the first step is to do an environmental scan. And I wish I had a buck for every time I said, if you don't know how to do an external scan, then you don't know how to do an internal audit, because the scan leads to the audit. And we talked a little bit about internal audits before. And there's a model in the beginning of the chapter that presents the picture, a single illustration of what an internal audit looks like. An internal audit has to do with value within the organization. Are each of its parts participating in a fashion to add value to the organization? And what's the model? It's called the productivity model. And what does it do? It maximizes the use of resources, which minimize the expenses. And it maximizes also the opportunity for revenue, outcomes associated with revenue. And what minimizes the costs and maximizes the outcomes? The system that lies in between. Everything is a system. And so that's the internal audit. That's how we look within the organization. So you have each of the functions. Let's say you have a functional organization, which most are, and you're looking at the accounting department, all of the operations department. Let's say if it's a lodging entity, food and beverage, rooms division, marina operations perhaps, casino operations perhaps, spa operations, recreation, golf courses, all of those things. Those are the operating units. Those are the sector units. And around those you have the functional units. And the functional units are the staff individuals that support the line. And the line is the operation. So, when one conducts a strategic plan, and I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you, maybe many of you, have had the opportunity to participate in this process, we look at it function by function. And we look inside to identify what are we doing really well and what could we do better. Well, if we take the external scan and we add that to the internal audit, we've now conducted the common term SWOT, S-W-O-T, analysis. Strengths, weaknesses inside, opportunities and threats outside. Now we have a snapshot. Now we have a picture. And so what's the next step? The next step is we compare those factors to our mission. Does our mission still make sense? And we do this every year. And we look at it every year. And if the answer is yes, then we proceed. If the answer is no, then we need to find a new business. And you can think of examples, I'm sure, of individuals who have had to change the direction of an organization because its business model no longer made sense. The business it was in no longer made sense. In all of the sectors of our industry, and this is true, I'm sure, of every industry, if you had to establish a blueprint model for all missions of all organizations within all sectors, a simply stated mission is the acquisition and maintenance of guests, customers, passengers, whatever you want to call them. You have strategies to acquire new ones, and you have strategies to maintain existing ones, called repeat guests. And there may be an objective to use marketing functions to seek and acquire new sources of guests, giving you a new inflow. And we make sure through our services, our service systems, that we maintain the guests we have. And so if that's true, if an organization is in the business of acquiring and maintaining guests, guess what? The human resource department is in the business of acquiring and maintaining human capital. And so we have a mission-driven organization. If that's the mission of the organization, and then that's the mission of the Human Resource Office, then the Human Resource Office matches the mission of the organization. From the mission, we take our information from the SWOT and do our best to forecast the future. And as you know, there are millions and millions of scientific methods out there, but no one has certainty, as recent economic times tell us. But we do our best to forecast the future. And we play what if. What if the future we think is going to happen doesn't happen? What if there's a surprise? Well, then we start establishing contingency plans. So now, from the external scan and the internal audit and the review of our mission and the findings of our forecast, now we establish some targets for performance. And we call those LTOs, long-term objectives. An objective is a target for performance. And those objectives are passive because they just sit there. It's a wish. It's something we want to achieve. but we haven't achieved it yet. How do we achieve it? We establish the action steps, which are the strategies. The strategies are the action steps that lead to the attainment of objectives. And the strategies, as you know, we've said this already, the strategies produce the guidelines for behavior and performance called policies. And the policies generate the benchmarks for performance and behavior called standards. And then we could take it to each unit, each tactical unit, and within each unit we establish short-term objectives, short-term targets for performance. We generate the action steps for achieving those objectives, just the strategies are the action steps for long-term objectives, tactics are the strategies for short-term objectives, and then from those we deduce procedures. And the procedures are step by step by step, incremental ways to accomplish performance that will render our stated objectives. And so we've already discussed the short version of it: objectives, standards, policy, or objectives, strategies, policies, procedures, policies, standards, procedures, and rules. We also talked about rules. Rules are about behavior, and the other stuff's about performance. If we have those things in place and communicated well, we have a proactive organization. And that proactive organization, if every decision, whenever something has to be decided, if every decision says, every decision you have to make, you say to yourself, well, will this help us acquire and maintain the guests? And if the answer is yes, it's important. And if the answer is no, not so important. And that's how we prioritize our decisions. So in this chapter, it's about recruiting. It's strategic recruiting, strategic selection. And just as the external environment and the internal audit produce the drivers for our overall strategic plan, those same factors establish the drivers for recruitment and selection strategies. And the key external driver is called the labor market. And what is the labor market? As you know, if you've read the chapter, it's the KSAAs. It's the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and abilities that exist in a local region, the region of the organization. Now, what determines the strategies for recruitment and selection? Now remember, nothing's mutually exclusive. Everything feeds something else. The reason we go through a process is because something leads to something, leads to something, leads to something. And then when we do the PERT chart about it, something, something, something leads to something, which leads to something, and then leads to something, something, something. It's all related. So what's the key driver here in the HR office? Key driver? Job analysis. It's an action that is associated with job design, as you recall. Job analysis generates job specifications, qualifications for a position, and job descriptions, job tasks, duties, and responsibilities associated with each position. And when we look at our needs from that perspective, from a job analysis perspective, and we compare those to what we know about the external environment vis-a-vis the labor market, we then have enough information to establish a proactive strategy to accomplish recruitment and selection. And as you know, recruitment and selection are two different things. A lot of people don't know that, but recruitment is generating a pool of qualified applicants from outside somewhere or inside, internal and external. We've seen that in the chapter. And selection is choosing from that pool the most qualified applicant that we can get. And the recruiting sources as are both internal and external, and you're provided with a chart that shows those. And the recruitment process, successful recruitment process will render a pool of applicants that will then go into the selection process. And then once individuals are fed into the selection process, that function is called pre-employment. As you know, the HR people don't hire people. The HR people recommend people and for hire. And then the operating managers make the ultimate decision. The hiring official is always the chief individual of a department or a manager within that department seeking individuals for his or her work unit. So we walk you through the entire process, generating a pool of applicants, and then there are numerous processes for selecting from within that pool most qualified individuals. And the one thing that is always, always, always consistent is that every applicant must complete, either in person or online, an application blank. We call it a blank. It's a form. It's a blank. And that form serves two purposes. It provides us with preliminary information, and of course we include, you have a resume too. The form provides us with specific, conclusive information about the history of the job candidate, the job applicant. And the second important function is it's the original establishment of employment at will status, if it's an at will employer, as well as it establishes the behavioral necessities that are job related in order to get a position. And it does that through very specific questions and ends up with a statement that the applicant reads and understands, and then a signature. That's for instance. And as you know, in all things HR, in all things business, but in all things HR, the legal environment is huge. I mean, it's a big, big factor. I think one of the questions I'll ask you during the week, do you know anybody that has had a legal issue with regard to the recruitment or selection process? And I'm sure you do. I'm sure you know something. And the reason that that the application blank is so crucial is now we have the opportunity to do a thorough, and always thorough, and I was going to say maybe not, but yeah, it is, always thorough, look into an individual's background. And as far as the job specification, which gives the qualifications for a position, those factors are determined by an individual's resume. And an individual writes a resume that tells us their value proposition. Why am I so good? What specific things do I know? Can I do? Have I done? That tell you I'm the greatest that there is relative to everybody else competing for this job. And then once we have the application blank, we will go through the checklist that are shown in the book of processes, and some of the processes must include background investigations for criminal felony situations. And if you look closely at the application blank, we don't ask if an individual has been convicted of a felony. We also ask, it's funny, I had jury duty not too long ago, last week or something, and I like to talk to people, so I don't really like to talk to people, but I do it when I'm bored. So yeah, I'm sitting outside this courthouse waiting for my call, and I'm talking to criminals, basically. And I knew this as a practitioner. I always knew this, that the majority of individuals, when they start their criminal careers, no offense to any criminals out there, when they start their criminal careers, the courts usually give them a break. And in many cases, the courts, during pretrial hearings, will give the opportunity for an individual to instead of pleading not guilty or guilty, will give the individual the opportunity to plead no contest. And if in most cases an individual pleads no contest, the judge may or may not, but in many cases the judge will document that case as a case of no contest, adjudication withheld. In other words, there's no judgment. The person has not been convicted. I was talking with a person out there has had adjudication withheld on 4 to 5 counts of burglary on a structure. And another thing that could happen is they could be adjudicated in the criminal courts. They could be adjudicated, in which case, a person is falsifying an application if he or she puts no when asked if you've been convicted of a felony. But if he or she has not been adjudicated, but could be a career criminal, has not been adjudicated, and checks no next to adjudication withheld, and usually it'll say adjudication withheld, no contest, then you have standing to eliminate that person from the pre-employment process. And that's what the application blank is all about. It's about taking individuals and putting them in a box. And when they sign off at the end, it says, if you misled us, if you withheld information from us, if you omitted anything, if you lied, you're out immediately. That's basically what the last few lines say. That's your catch-22 at the end of the application blank. And then how do you do the background check? This came up before in our discussions. There's a concept known as chain of custody. It's a legal concept, chain of custody. So if you apply to a position in my HR office, I am the custodian of records, so I'm responsible for that. If you remember last chapter, we talked about negligent maintenance and disclosure of records. That would be my responsibility if I breach that. And so what we do is we farm out to third parties any aspect of pre-employment that could be determined to be knowledge of information that could discriminate against an individual. So background checks, criminal background checks. In my practice, I've always retained very good private investigation firms. And they would be the people I pay a fee per applicant, per every person I passed on, every applicant I passed on, to them. Actually, I paid a retainer fee, so they would do so many for free up to a certain amount. So they would do the background checks. I don't have any record of it. And nobody in my office has knowledge of it, except me. And in the event of drug testing, or any kind of physiological testing, chain of custody, so in the criminal case, the chain of custody goes to the PIs. In drug testing cases, the chain of custody goes to the medical labs. They're the ones who have the chain of custody. So why is chain of custody important? It's because if something unfavorable happens and you don't get a job, let's say, and you come after me, and if your rationale is, your criminal record, excuse me, I don't have responsibility for the people that I contracted to do that to. And in the case of a false positive blood work or urine work, I don't have any responsibility for that. The lab does. So again, it's strategy, it's recruitment, and selection in this chapter. It runs from the overall strategic plan for the organizations. We're out of time. I'll see you in the next.